Welcome to this explainer. Today we are diving straight into something completely fascinating. We're going to neutrally unpack a really rigorous AI stress test of 3 official court documents. We want to see how a verdict actually holds up when you put it under the strict microscopes of logic, linguistics, and evidentiary law. It's essentially a deep dive into the very anatomy of a verdict.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, deconstructing the 3 legal documents. Second, the missing evidence pillars. Third, the anatomy of logical fallacies. Fourth, the collapse of legal language. And finally, procedural flaws and the final verdict. Let's get right into it.
All right, part 1. Deconstructing 3 legal documents. Now, to properly audit any legal process, we have to know exactly which papers are sitting on the desk, right? The source material we're looking at scrutinizes 3 sequential documents, specifically tracking how arguments and evidence were passed down from the initial charge all the way to the final appellate ruling. Phase 1 is the indictment from the prosecutor, Phase 2 is the first instance judgment from the trial court, and Phase 3 is the second instance ruling. That's the appellate court's final decision. The AI basically looked at how the legal narrative evolved, or, didn't evolve, across this entire timeline.
The stark contrast in these scores is pretty wild. While the documents look formally correct on the surface, scoring a solid 7 out of 10 for formal compliance, the AI gave them absolute failing grades in logic and evidence. Logic scored a mere 2 and evidence just a 3. So this comprehensive AI review yielded an overall score of just 4 out of 10. The structure of the documents was generally sound, sure, but the substantive weight inside those structures, the actual proof and the reasoning, was found to be severely lacking.
Moving on to part 2, the missing evidence pillars. Let's take a look at what the AI calls the empty boxes. These are the places where concrete facts absolutely should be. In any criminal trial, the prosecution obviously carries the burden to fill specific evidentiary pillars to prove a crime occurred. The AI points out that for this specific crime, picking quarrels and provoking trouble online, the prosecution literally has to definitively prove 3 sequential steps. First, they have to prove the information shared was demonstrably false. Second, they must prove knowing intent, meaning the defendant actually knew it was false but went ahead and shared it anyway. And third, they need to prove this action caused severe public disorder. Make no mistake, if any of these pillars are missing, the whole legal structure just collapses.
And this tension is at the very core of the AI's analysis. The strict legal requirement for hard data was consistently met with broad, empty labels across all 3 documents. Think about it. Where the law demands verifiable facts to prove information is false, the AI found only subjective conclusions. Where the law demands transmission data to show the scale of an act, the AI found 0 data, none. The documents leaned heavily on sweeping terms like spreading false speech without actually pointing to which specific speech was false, or frankly, providing any data to back it up. Specifically, when looking at that third pillar, severe public disorder, the analysis notes a complete and utter absence of transmission metrics or real-world consequences. The law typically requires actual metrics, a certain number of clicks, retweets, or tangible evidence of real-world societal panic. But the AI's review revealed a complete blank slate. No metrics, no reports of public disruption, no victim statements whatsoever. Just the repeated, unsupported phrase that public order was, quote, severely confused.
Which brings us to part 3, anatomy of logical fallacies.
So you might be wondering, if the evidence boxes were empty, how on earth did the documents reach a guilty verdict? Well, the AI found the answer in logical fallacies. Take the ad hominem fallacy, for instance. To really grasp the analysis, we first need to define this. It's essentially attacking or relying on the person rather than the actual proof. In a legal context, it means using who the person is, say their job, their background, their education, to illegally presume they committed an act or had a specific intent, instead of providing hard evidence of that intent.
And this is a crucial point. The AI highlights an exact quote from the judgment as a glaring ad hominem leap. It illegally uses the defendant's education level to presume that the knowing intent box was checked. Because the prosecution lacked evidence that the defendant actually knew the information was false, the text substitutes his high education level to say he, quote, should have known. The AI flags this as a fundamental error. You simply cannot use should have known based on someone's identity to legally prove they did know as a factual piece of evidence. It just doesn't work that way.
The source analysis also identifies non sequiturs, which literally translates to, it does not follow. This points to a severe disconnect in the reasoning of the documents.
A non sequitur happens when you take step A, and then suddenly, boom, you declare you've arrived at step Z, completely skipping all the required logical steps in between.
The analysis uncovered a completely broken logical chain, and it's wild when you map out how these arguments build. The text shows the defendant forwarded online content. Okay, that's a fact. But then it immediately jumps to labeling that content false without any verification. Then it presumes intent based on education. And finally, it declares a severe disruption of public order without any causal link or data. The AI reveals that the conclusion of a crime simply does not logically follow from the basic premise of just forwarding a message.
All right, part 4, the collapse of legal language.
Zooming in closer to the actual words used in the courtroom, the analysis asks us to consider a fascinating question. When does a fact become a pseudo-proposition? Now, a pseudo-proposition is a sentence that looks like a factual statement but completely lacks a verifiable subject in reality, like that unproven claim of severe disorder. When the court document says it caused severe public disorder, grammatically, yeah, it sounds exactly like a fact, but linguistically and legally, because there is no tangible event, no data, and absolutely no victim attached to those words, it is a pseudo-proposition. It's an empty vessel. It's a statement that literally cannot be proven true or false because it points to nothing in the real world.
Furthermore, the source introduces this concept of a category mistake, which is a foundational error in how language is categorized. Imagine asking, what color is the number 7? That is a category mistake. You're applying the category of color to the category of mathematics. Well, the AI found a massive category mistake right at the heart of the prosecution's case regarding this whole concept of false information.
The analysis argues this category mistake occurred because the documents heavily penalized subjective opinions in art by treating them as if they were verifiable objective facts. The law explicitly requires false information to be a factual statement that can be objectively disproven. However, the AI noted that the content being targeted here actually consisted of political cartoons, emotional expressions, and subjective commentary. These belong to the category of opinion or art. They inherently don't possess a true or false value. By legally labeling a satirical cartoon as false factual information, the documents committed a profound linguistic and legal category mistake.
Let's pan out for our final lens, Part 5, Procedural Flaws and Final Verdict.
Let's look at how the appellate system handled all these flaws we just talked about. The structural breakdown reveals several procedural anomalies. Most notably, the second instance court merely confirmed the first judgment without conducting the legally required substantive review. The AI analysis points out that the first trial was actually held behind closed doors without a clear legal justification. Then, despite massive disputes over the facts and the law, the appellate court decided not to even hold a hearing. So instead of acting as a review mechanism to catch all the logical and evidentiary errors we've been discussing, the AI concluded the second instance court acted merely as a confirmation mechanism. They basically just rubber-stamped the lower court's decision, completely leaving the defense's counterarguments unaddressed.
One specific quote perfectly distills the AI's ultimate verdict on the texts. The judgment proved the behavior, but did not prove the crime. Yes, the evidence showed someone clicked forward on a piece of content. We know that happened. But everything after that, the falsity, the malicious intent, the severe societal harm, all of it was constructed out of logical fallacies, category mistakes, and empty legal language rather than hard, verifiable evidence.
As we wrap up this explainer, I'm going to leave you with a pretty provocative thought. What is the ultimate consequence of language losing its precise meaning inside a courtroom? What happens to the bedrock of justice when the very words and logic it relies upon begin to collapse? The AI's stress test of these documents reveals that when subjective opinions are legally categorized as false facts, and when identity replaces actual evidence of intent, the actual machinery of the law breaks down. It really forces us to ask, if a legal document can formally look absolutely perfect on the outside, but be entirely empty of logic and evidence on the inside, how do we ensure the integrity of the judicial process moving forward? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the anatomy of a verdict.